The first shell screamed over Muang Thon Valley at dusk on March 13, 1954, its whistle cutting through mountain mist as General Vo Nguyen Giap's gunners touched fire to primer cords hidden in caves carved from living rock. This moment would shatter empires. In 56 days, a peasant army would prove that no colonial power, no matter how modern its aircraft or seasoned its legionnaires, could survive when an entire nation rose to expel invaders. The reverberations from this remote valley in northern Vietnam would echo through Algeria, Indonesia, and every corner of the crumbling European colonial system. The Muang Thon Valley stretched 20 kilometers long by 6 wide, a rice bowl cupped in jungle-covered mountains 400 meters above sea level. To French eyes, it resembled a natural fortress, defensible terrain, where their airborne elite could dig in and dare the Viet Minh to attack. They were half right about the fortress part. Giap saw something different when he first studied aerial reconnaissance photos in January. The valley floor sat exposed under commanding heights that formed a perfect amphitheater of death. Whoever controlled those ridges could rain shells down like a monsoon of steel. The French had taken the valley. The Viet Minh would take the hills. For months, Giap had wrestled with competing strategies. His Chinese advisors, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, initially pushed for strike quickly, win quickly, a rapid assault that would overwhelm the French before they could reinforce. But on January 26th, Giap made the crucial decision that would determine the battle's outcome. He scratched those plans and adopted strike surely, advance surely. This meant patience. It meant weeks of back-breaking labor to build roads where no roads had existed, hauling artillery pieces up mountain paths that challenged the limits of human endurance. It meant transforming 5 full divisions, the 308, 312, 316, 304, and the massive 351 Heavy Artillery Division into a siege force that could sustain operations in the most remote corner of Indochina. The logistics alone staggered comprehension. More than 260,000 porters, the Dan Cong, would carry 20,000 tons of supplies over mountain passes where mist clung to switchbacks locals called "where heaven meets earth." Rice, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain an army, had to move on human backs or reinforced French bicycles loaded with impossibly heavy loads. But first, the guns had to reach the heights. Through Pha Dinh Pass they came, 32 kilometers of mud and mist at 1,648 meters elevation. Teams of men hauled artillery pieces by rope and raw determination, their hemp lines burning palms as they fought gravity and exhaustion up slopes that seemed to climb into the clouds themselves. The work song, Ho Kio Phao, pulling artillery, rose from their ranks, voices cutting through wind whistle and the scrape of metal on stone. Some porters pushed bicycles so overloaded with rice sacks that the riders disappeared behind wobbling towers of grain. Others carried 150-kilogram loads balanced on reinforced frames that left shoulders raw and bleeding. They moved at night when possible, ghosts in canvas shoes that gripped wet clay better than any military boot. By early March, Giap had positioned his divisions around the valley, like fingers closing on a throat. The heights bristled with artillery pieces dug into caves and camouflaged firing positions that would prove nearly impossible for French spotters to locate. Single guns sat in bomb-proof shelters with precisely angled firing ports, their crews trained by Chinese instructors in direct fire techniques that would shock French artillerymen accustomed to more conventional warfare. The French garrison below numbered roughly 16,000 men, foreign legionnaires, colonial paratroops, and Vietnamese auxiliaries concentrated in a series of strongpoints with feminine names: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Françoise, Dominique, Claudine, Eliane, Huguette, Isabelle. Their commander, Colonel Christian de Castries, remained confident that superior firepower and air support would break any Viet Minh assault. He had no idea that his artillery chief, Colonel Charles Piroth, was about to face the most devastating surprise of his career, or that 261,000 Vietnamese laborers had just finished building the infrastructure for his destruction. Picture yourself crouched in one of those mountain caves as March 13th approached, watching French aircraft circle the valley floor like lazy insects, while your comrades made final adjustments to gun sights chalked with firing solutions. As twilight deepened over Muang Thon Valley, Giap's signalers prepared to send the code word that would unleash 56 days of coordinated fury and announce to the world that the age of European empire was ending, one artillery shell at a time. If you're finding yourself drawn into this forgotten chapter of history, Hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the perspectives that textbooks often overlook. I'm coming to you live from Ho Chi Minh City at 8:30 p.m., where the echoes of these events still shape daily life 70 years later. The first barrage was about to begin, and Phan Dinh Giot was checking his grenades one final time as assault teams prepared to storm the French positions at Him Lam, but victory would demand a price that would test even the most devoted revolutionaries' resolve. Phan Dinh Giot pressed his bleeding body against the concrete firing slit as machine gun bullets tore through the night air inches from his skull, his weight the only thing standing between his platoon and annihilation at Strongpoint Beatrice. This single act of desperate courage embodied the revolutionary fervour that would break French colonial power forever. In the next 72 hours, the world would witness warfare transformed not by technology or doctrine, but by the willingness of common soldiers to sacrifice everything for independence. The synchronized barrage began at 1800 hours on March 13th, as Giap had calculated. Dusk masked the gun flashes and troop movements while providing enough light for his artillery observers to direct fire with devastating precision. From caves carved into the surrounding heights, 105mm howitzers, 120mm mortars, and 75mm guns opened fire simultaneously across the valley. The sound was unlike anything the French garrison had experienced. Not the sporadic harassing fire they expected from guerrillas, but the coordinated thunder of divisional artillery directed by Chinese-trained observers who had studied their targets for weeks. Shells walked methodically across the French positions at Him Lam the hill, the French called Beatrice. Each impact calculated to strip away defensive layers like peeling an onion. Inside the French bunkers, the world became a chaos of concrete dust, ringing ears, and the acrid smell of high explosive. Radio communications crackled with damage reports as observation posts went silent one by one. The artillery preparation lasted exactly 30 minutes, long enough to pulverize defensive positions, short enough to preserve ammunition for the infantry assault that followed. When the barrage lifted, Viet Minh assault teams emerged from approach trenches they had dug to within grenade range of the French wire. They moved in disciplined waves, Bangalore torpedoes and shaped charges, clearing paths through obstacles that had taken the French weeks to emplace. Whistling tracer lit the darkness as French machine guns opened fire from positions that had survived the bombardment. This was when Giot made his choice. The 23-year-old platoon leader had already been wounded by shell fragments, his grenades expended in the assault on the outer defences. His men were pinned down by interlocking fire from a bunker that commanded the approach to the hill's summit. Without suppressing that position, the attack would stall and his comrades would die in the wire. At 22:30 hours, Giot crawled forward through mud mixed with cordite and blood. The bunker's firing slit spat orange flame as its machine gun traversed left and right, cutting down anyone who attempted to advance. In the darkness, the muzzle flash looked like a dragon's eye blinking with mechanical fury. Giot reached the concrete wall and pressed his body against the firing port, his torn uniform and flesh absorbing the bullets meant for his platoon. He held the position as his men rushed the bunker with satchel charges, his life the price of their advance. When the explosions finally silenced the machine gun, Giot's body fell away from the slit, another name for the revolutionary martyr's role, another story for the political officers to tell new recruits. But individual heroism, however inspiring, was only part of the equation. The real shock came from the Viet Minh artillery, which had fundamentally altered the tactical balance in ways that French commanders struggled to comprehend. Colonel Charles Piroth, the garrison's artillery chief, had boasted that his guns would demolish any Viet Minh force foolish enough to mass around Dien Bien Phu. A veteran of 2 world wars, Piroth commanded 24 105mm howitzers, 4 155mm guns, and 16 120mm mortars, more than enough firepower to dominate a conventional battlefield. What he encountered instead shattered his professional confidence and ultimately his will to live. The Viet Minh guns were invisible. Dug as single pieces into cave positions with precisely angled firing ports, they appeared only long enough to fire and then vanished into the landscape. French counter-battery fire hammered empty ridgelines, while the real guns remained untouched in their rock shelters. Worse, the enemy artillery demonstrated techniques that suggested professional training far beyond anything expected from guerrilla forces. Direct fire shots struck French positions with sniper-like precision. Shells landed in sequence to achieve maximum psychological effect. First the command posts, then communications, then the gun positions themselves. The Viet Minh had clearly studied each target and assigned specific missions to specific batteries, coordinating their fire like a symphony of destruction conducted by an invisible maestro. By dawn on March 14th, Beatrice had fallen. 2 senior French commanders lay dead in the rubble, killed within hours of the assault's opening. The loss of the hill gave Viet Minh observers perfect views of the airstrip, which came under immediate and accurate fire from positions that French spotters could not locate. The psychological impact rippled through the garrison like shockwaves from the artillery itself. These were not the ragged guerrillas of French imagination, but professional soldiers executing a meticulously planned siege operation. The realization struck French officers with the force of revelation. They were not fighting an insurgency, but a conventional army that had simply chosen unconventional methods. Heavy anti-aircraft fire made resupply flights suicidal below 2,000 meters. Parachute drops from higher altitudes scattered supplies across a valley, increasingly controlled by Viet Minh infantry, who redistributed captured ammunition and medical supplies to their own forces before dawn. The French garrison was slowly being strangled. On March 15th, before sunrise, Colonel Piroth pulled the pin from a grenade and held it against his chest in his command bunker. His final words, according to survivors, acknowledged the impossible. "I have been dishonored. I am responsible for the defeat. I die because of my mistake." French authorities tried to conceal the suicide to preserve morale, but whispers spread through the garrison like infection. If their artillery chief, a decorated veteran with decades of experience, had lost faith in their chances, what hope remained for the rest of them? Imagine yourself in one of those shattered French positions as the second day dawned, watching supply parachutes drift into enemy hands while shells continued to fall from guns you could neither see nor silence. The Thai auxiliaries at Strongpoint Anne Marie were already listening to Viet Minh loudspeakers that echoed across the valley each night, voices speaking their language and telling them this was not their fight, a message that would soon find fertile ground in hearts already shaken by the artillery's thunder. Fog rolled across Strongpoint Anne Marie on the morning of March 17th, as Thai auxiliaries slipped away from their positions like ghosts dissolving into mist, their French officers waking to find empty trenches where a battalion had stood guard the night before. This mass desertion revealed the deeper truth about colonial warfare. Empires depend on willing collaboration, and when that consent evaporates, even the most powerful military machine becomes a hollow shell. The French were about to learn that controlling territory means nothing if the people themselves reject your presence. The Thai soldiers had been listening to Viet Minh loudspeakers for weeks. Every night, voices speaking their language drifted across the valley, carried on mountain winds that seemed to whisper directly into their ears. "This is not your fight." The speakers repeated in dialects that reminded them of home villages far from this contested valley. Why die for foreigners who will abandon you when the fighting ends? The psychological warfare proved more effective than artillery. These mountain people had no particular loyalty to French colonial rule, serving mainly for pay and the promise of protection for their families. As Viet Minh shells demonstrated French vulnerability, that protection looked increasingly hollow. When dawn broke on March 17th and revealed empty fighting positions, French officers realized they faced something more dangerous than enemy attack: the dissolution of their own forces. But the Thai withdrawal was only part of a larger catastrophe unfolding around the isolated garrison. The airstrip, Dien Bien Phu's lifeline to the outside world, had been under accurate fire since March 14th. Every landing attempt drew concentrated fire from positions French spotters could not identify, forcing pilots to climb higher and higher until wind drift scattered supply parachutes across a valley increasingly controlled by Viet Minh infantry. The mathematics of siege warfare were becoming brutally clear. The French garrison consumed roughly 40 tons of supplies per day: ammunition, food, medical supplies, fuel for their vehicles and generators. All of it now had to fall from the sky, and much of it was falling into enemy hands. Viet Minh scouts had learned the timing of French supply drops, positioning themselves to intercept parachutes that thumped into rice paddies under cover of darkness. Red, white, and green silk canopies became valuable commodities, cut up and redistributed as camouflage and makeshift equipment before dawn revealed their locations to French observers. The irony was savage. French supplies were feeding the siege that was slowly strangling their own garrison. Meanwhile, the logistics operation that made this siege possible continued its relentless rhythm in the mountains surrounding the valley. The Dankong civilian porters, whose contribution would prove decisive, had transformed the supply situation from impossible to merely superhuman. 261,000 laborers fielded nearly 21,000 pack bikes, raising carrying capacity by roughly 1,000 tons compared to earlier operations. Picture the scene along mountain trails that snake through clouds, porters pushing reinforced French bicycles loaded with 150 to 200 kilogram loads, rice sacks lashed so high the riders disappeared behind wobbling towers of grain. The bicycles themselves became symbols of resourcefulness, captured French equipment repurposed to carry the ammunition that would destroy French positions. The work was brutal beyond description. Teams hauled artillery pieces by rope through switchbacks, where a single stumble meant death on rocks hundreds of meters below. Hemp ropes burned palms raw, leather straps cut shoulders to bone, and the constant climbing left men gasping in thin mountain air that tasted of pine needles and approaching monsoon. Hockey Phao, the artillery-pulling song, emerged from this suffering, voices rising to match each laboured step up slopes that seemed to climb into the sky itself. The cadence helped coordinate effort, dozens of men pulling in unison as gun carriages scraped over stones worn smooth by centuries of mountain weather. The sound of gravel under canvas sandals mixed with heavy breathing and the creak of rope under impossible loads. Total logistics for the campaign reached 20,000 tons, 14,950 tons of rice, 1,200 tons of ammunition, 1,873 tons of fuel. Most of it moved on human backs over trails that challenged the limits of endurance. Some porters wore improvised rubber tire sandals, deplop, that gripped slick clay better than any military boot, but left distinctive chevron patterns that scouts learned to reverse to confuse enemy trackers. The Pha Dinh Pass remained the critical bottleneck, 32 kilometers of mud and mist at 1,648 meters elevation, where teams hauled cannons through switchbacks locals called "where heaven meets earth." Veterans still recalled shouldering rice loads until the straps bled their collarbones raw, their sacrifice measured in tons delivered rather than glory won. But ammunition and rice were only part of what sustained the siege. The Viet Minh were also moving something more precious, the will to continue fighting regardless of cost. Political officers accompanied every supply column, reminding porters that every grain of rice carried was a bullet fired at colonialism. Every artillery shell delivered was a step toward independence. This ideological mobilization extended far beyond the immediate battle zone. Thanh Hoa province alone sent tens of thousands of porters, entire villages emptying to support the campaign. Families donated their strongest men and their best bicycles, understanding that Dien Bien Phu represented something larger than a single military engagement. By late March, the accumulated weight of this logistical miracle was becoming visible in the valley itself. Trench lines began spider-webbing toward French positions, covered with bamboo mats and packed earth to create tunnels that crept closer each night. Sappers worked in shifts, digging approach trenches that would allow assault troops to reach French wire without crossing open ground under defensive fire. The sight unnerved French defenders who watched enemy positions creep closer like some inexorable tide. Each dawn revealed new earthworks, fresh scars in the landscape that marked Viet Minh progress toward the heart of their defenses. Radio intercepts caught French voices expressing growing desperation. They're everywhere and nowhere. How do you fight an army that lives underground? Imagine yourself peering over a French parapet as another night fell, knowing that invisible enemies were digging closer while your supply situation grew more desperate with each failed airdrop. The Viet Minh approach trenches would soon reach grenade range of strongpoints Dominique and Eliane, and when they did, the siege would enter a new phase that would test both armies beyond anything they had previously endured. Sappers crawled through absolute darkness 49 meters beneath strongpoint Eliane 2, their fingernails packed with clay and cordite grit as they packed 1,000 kilograms of explosives into a chamber that would soon erase a French hilltop from existence. This subterranean warfare represented the ultimate fusion of peasant cunning and modern military engineering, proof that determination could overcome any technological advantage when applied with sufficient patience and sacrifice. In the tunnels beneath Dien Bien Phu, the future of empires was being decided one shovelful of earth at a time. By late March, the siege had evolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare. What had begun as conventional attacks on fortified positions was transforming into a three-dimensional battle, fought simultaneously above ground, on the surface, and in an expanding network of tunnels that honeycombed the valley floor, like termite galleries. Viet Minh trench lines spider-webbed toward French strongpoints, Dominique, Claudine, and Eliane, each approach covered with bamboo mats and packed earth that transformed open ditches into concealed tunnels. Working in shifts through nights black as tar, Sappers extended these underground highways closer to French defensive wire, while their comrades above ground provided covering fire and distraction. The work demanded a special kind of courage. Tunnel diggers crawled through spaces barely wide enough for human shoulders, breathing air thick with the smell of wet earth and human sweat. They worked by touch, feeling their way forward with fingertips while enemy sentries walked overhead, sometimes close enough that whispered conversations carried down through the soil. Every few meters, the tunnels branched into small chambers where explosives could be stored or wounded, men could rest during their journey to rear areas. The network grew like living tissue, extending tendrils toward French positions while main arteries carried supplies and reinforcements from the mountain bases where Giap's divisions waited for the final assault. On March 30th and 31st, this underground preparation paid dividends in blood. The Viet Minh launched coordinated assaults against strongpoints Dominique and Elian, just as monsoon clouds gathered over the valley. Rain began falling in sheets that turned the battlefield into a slick chaos of mud, blood, and cordite smoke. Parachute flares burst overhead like artificial stars, their harsh white light casting moving shadows as assault teams cut through French wire with Bangalore torpedoes carried in split bamboo tubes. French defenders responded with everything they had. 105mm howitzers, designed for long-range fire, were pressed into service at zero-elevation giant shotguns that fired directly into attacking waves. The shells tore lanes through Viet Minh formations caught in the open, proof that strike surely sometimes meant accepting horrific casualties when tactical necessity demanded immediate action. But for every attack wave that French artillery shattered, another emerged from the tunnel network. Assault troops appeared from positions that should have been empty, materializing from the earth itself like warriors born from the soil they fought to liberate. The psychological effect on French defenders was devastating. How do you fight an enemy that seems to rise from the ground beneath your feet? The Nam Yum River, which meandered through the valley floor, became a geographic marker of the battle's intensity. Its waters ran thick with runoff from the heights, carrying the detritus of war, abandoned equipment, medical waste, and the inevitable human cost of siege warfare. Rain-spattered helmets reflected parachute flare light as sappers continued their work, cutting wire and laying charges while tracers whistled overhead in deadly geometric patterns. Viet Minh soldiers adapted their equipment to the brutal conditions. Canvas, liberation shoes from Chinese supply dumps mixed with improvised rubber tire sandals deplope that gripped slick clay and survived days of slogging through monsoon muck. The tire tread patterns left distinctive chevron marks in mud, leading Viet Minh scouts to reverse their sandals when moving through contested areas to confuse French trackers trying to map enemy positions. Food became another challenge as the siege intensified. Soldiers boiled wild greens with rice and salt sesame paste mui vung, creating meals that provided basic nutrition, while their digestive systems adapted to the stress of constant combat. On wet nights, leeches found exposed skin where watch straps rubbed wrists and sandal straps chafed ankles, adding another layer of misery to conditions that already tested human endurance. Medical care in the tunnels demanded improvisation that would have challenged peacetime surgeons. Field medics dressed wounds with scarce sulfur powder and boiled cloth strips, working by candlelight in chambers that reeked of iodine, smoke, and the inevitable stench of battlefield latrines. The iodine sting, mixed with cordite residue and human waste, created an olfactory signature that veterans would never forget the smell of Revolutionary War fought in confined spaces. But the most sophisticated aspect of this underground campaign was the mining operations themselves. Viet Minh engineers, many trained by Chinese advisors in techniques developed during their own civil war, calculated precisely how much explosive would be needed to collapse specific French positions. The tunnel under Elian II represented the pinnacle of this engineering, 49 meters of carefully surveyed excavation, leading to a chamber packed with enough TNT to crater the hilltop. The psychological warfare continued above ground as Viet Minh AA fire thickened around the valley. At least two 37mm battalions, roughly 24 guns, plus 12.7mm heavy machine guns, made low-level resupply flights suicidal. French pilots climbed higher to avoid the flak, but wind drift at altitude carried many parachute bundles directly into Viet Minh trenches. Enemy soldiers would emerge after dark to cut silk parachutes and redistribute captured supplies before dawn revealed their positions to French observers. Red, white, and green chutes disappeared into the tunnel network, their silk repurposed as camouflage nets and medical bandages, while captured ammunition fed the very guns that were strangling the French garrison. In trench bays scattered across the valley, Viet Minh soldiers swapped verses of Giai Phong Dien Bien, Liberate Dien Bien, and scratched the names of home villages into ammunition crate planks that served as duckboards over muddy trench floors. These small acts of identity preservation helped maintain morale during weeks of underground warfare that tested revolutionary commitment like nothing they had previously experienced. Imagine yourself crawling through one of those tunnels as explosions shook earth from the ceiling above, knowing that somewhere in the darkness ahead lay either victory or a grave carved from the very soil you fought to liberate. The great mine under Elian II was nearly ready, its detonation timed to coincide with an assault that would demonstrate once and for all whether peasant determination could crack the shell of colonial power. But first, the Geneva Conference was about to begin, adding diplomatic urgency to military necessity. At precisely 10:26 a.m. on April 26, 1954, diplomats gathered around polished tables in Geneva, while 400 kilometers away, a Viet Minh sapper team lit the fuse that would detonate 1,000 kilograms of explosives beneath French strongpoint Elian II. The timing was no coincidence. Every trench gained, every bunker destroyed, every French position that fell to Viet Minh assault translated directly into leverage at the negotiating table where the future of Indochina was being decided. This was warfare as diplomacy by other means, each explosion in the valley echoing through conference rooms where empires were carved up with fountain pens instead of artillery shells. The Geneva Conference had opened with representatives from France, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and both Vietnamese governments attempting to find a political solution to 8 years of colonial war. But Giap understood that diplomacy without military pressure was merely conversation. Every day, his forces held their positions around Dien Bien Phu, strengthened the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's hand at negotiations that would determine whether the revolution succeeded or failed. Political officers reminded troops that the conference loomed over every tactical decision. Each trench gained is leverage at the table, they told soldiers huddled in monsoon-soaked bunkers where candle flames guttered in the damp air. The message was clear. Military success would determine political outcomes, making every assault as much about Geneva as about the valley itself. The Great Mine under Elian II represented the culmination of weeks of subterranean warfare that had transformed siege tactics. 49 meters of carefully surveyed tunnel led to a chamber packed with enough TNT to erase a French hilltop from existence. When the explosion finally came in early May, it would heave a crater that swallowed concrete bunkers whole and stunned defenders senseless, their ears bleeding from the concussion wave that rolled across the valley like thunder from beneath the earth. But mining was only one component of an increasingly sophisticated siege operation. Chinese advisors, led by General Vo Nguyen, had transformed Viet Minh staff work from guerrilla improvisation into professional military planning. The coaching extended beyond strategy into technical details, gunnery calculations, communications protocols, and logistics coordination that allowed 5 divisions to operate as a unified force rather than separate armies sharing the same battlefield. Chinese supplied equipment stiffened the siege in ways that French intelligence had failed to anticipate. 105mm howitzers provided counter-battery fire that silenced French guns one by one, while 37mm anti-aircraft guns created an umbrella of flak that made resupply flights increasingly suicidal. 2 full AA battalions, roughly 24 guns plus 12.7mm heavy machine guns, turned the valley into a death trap for any aircraft that ventured below 2,000 meters. French pilots adapted by climbing higher, but wind drift at altitude scattered parachute drops across terrain increasingly controlled by Viet Minh infantry. Supply bundles that should have reached French positions thumped into rice paddies where enemy scouts waited in the darkness, cutting silk shoots and redistributing captured ammunition before dawn revealed their locations. The irony grew more bitter with each failed drop. French artillery shells, captured intact from parachute bundles, were being fired back at French positions by Viet Minh gunners trained by Chinese instructors. Colonial ammunition was killing colonial soldiers, each misdirected parachute another nail in the garrison's coffin. Weather added another layer of misery to conditions that already challenged human endurance. Monsoon rains turned the valley floor into a sucking morass where movement required superhuman effort. Heart-shaped rice paddies, normally symbols of peaceful agriculture, became killing fields where mud reached the shins and every step risked sniper fire from positions that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. Men crawled on elbows through muck that mixed clay with cordite residue, and worse things that siege warfare inevitably produced: fingernails packed with grit, uniforms rotting from constant moisture, boots that squelched with each step through terrain that seemed designed to trap the unwary. The smell of wet earth mixed with human waste, medical alcohol, and the acrid tang of explosives created an olfactory signature that marked this particular corner of hell. In trench systems that now extended to within grenade range of French positions, Viet Minh soldiers maintained their equipment under conditions that would have challenged peacetime mechanics. Ammunition boxes swelled from moisture and stuck, requiring careful prying to avoid damaging precious shells. Sappers learned to warm blasting caps in their armpits before insertion, body heat preventing the temperature-sensitive explosives from misfiring at crucial moments. A mistimed fuse could mean death not just for the sapper, but for assault troops depending on perfectly coordinated explosions to breach French wire. The pressure created its own rituals: whispered curses when charges failed to detonate, quick prayers before lighting fuses, the superstitious habits that help soldiers maintain sanity when their lives depend on chemistry and timing beyond their control. Giap's staff had learned to track French morale through radio intercepts that revealed growing desperation within the garrison. Reports of command crisis, bunker-bound leadership, and plummeting confidence reinforced the decision to squeeze rather than spend lives in premature assaults. The strategy was working slowly, methodically, but working nonetheless. French strongpoints were becoming islands in an increasingly hostile sea. Dominique, Claudine, Eliane, the feminine names that had once suggested protective embrace, now marked isolated positions surrounded by enemies who emerged from the earth itself. Night brought the sound of digging, the scrape of shovels and picks that meant Viet Minh trenches were creeping closer while French defenders could only wait and wonder when the next assault would come. Cadres rotated companies through different tasks to maintain morale and distribute the psychological burden of siege warfare. One night, a unit might cut wire under tracer fire. The next, they would drag logs for trench revetments. The third, they would carry wounded comrades wrapped in ponchos that reeked of iodine and wet straw. The rotation system prevented any single group from bearing the full weight of combat stress that was grinding down both armies. Think of yourself huddled in a monsoon-soaked trench as May approached, knowing that diplomatic clocks in Geneva were ticking toward decisions that would determine whether your sacrifice had meaning or whether you would simply disappear into the mud of a forgotten valley. The final phase was about to begin, and when it did, Katyusha rockets would shriek over the valley like steel bamboo flutes. But first, a captured French tank would become an unlikely landmark in the approaching storm of fire and steel. A captured French M24 Bison tank sat jammed against a trench lip like a steel monument to futility, its frozen tracks marking the spot where Viet Minh sappers had learned to tunnel past the wreckage that soldiers whispered about as the Iron Buffalo. This single disabled vehicle embodied the technological hubris that had brought France to the edge of catastrophe in a remote mountain valley. All the modern equipment in the world meant nothing when your enemy emerged from the earth itself, turning industrial warfare into a contest of will fought in mud and darkness, where determination mattered more than horsepower. By early May, the siege had transformed Dien Bien Phu into a landscape that belonged more to the moon than to earth. Craters pocked the valley floor like smallpox scars, each one marking where Viet Minh shells had found their targets with increasing precision. The tank represented everything that had gone wrong with French strategy: sophisticated weapons rendered useless by an enemy who refused to fight on conventional terms. The M24 had been knocked out during one of the failed French counterattacks, its crew killed or wounded before they could reverse away from Viet Minh, positions that materialized from camouflaged trenches. Now it served as a navigation landmark for sappers, who crawled past its silent bulk on missions that would determine the battle's final outcome. The irony was perfect: French technology becoming a waypoint for the forces destroying French power. Viet Minh fighters had learned French strongpoint names by sound: Eliane, Huguette, Dominique, turning them into mnemonics for approach routes sketched on damp map sheets under guttering candles. The feminine names took on different meanings when whispered in trench systems, where men prepared for assaults that might be their last. Eliane became not just a position to capture, but a symbol of the colonial mentality that named Vietnamese terrain with European women's names. Equipment maintenance in the trenches demanded constant improvisation. Rain-soaked ammunition boxes swelled and stuck, requiring careful prying to avoid damaging precious shells. Weapons that had functioned perfectly in training camps struggled with the reality of monsoon moisture and constant exposure to mud that worked its way into every mechanism. Soldiers learned to strip and clean their rifles by touch in absolute darkness, their fingers mapping bolt assemblies and trigger mechanisms with the familiarity of prayer beads. The Viet Minh deployed flamethrowers sparingly, understanding that their psychological effect often exceeded their tactical value. More decisive were shaped charges and Bangalore torpedoes carried in split bamboo tubes, the equipment that could snake through wire obstacles under rain capes, while defenders struggled to track threats that moved like serpents through the darkness. French defenders, trapped in positions that had become concrete tombs, watched the enemy approach with the inevitability of rising floodwater. Each night brought the sound of digging closer to their perimeters, the scrape of entrenching tools that marked another few meters of Viet Minh progress toward their final protective wire. Sleep became a luxury, measured in minutes between artillery barrages that walked methodically across their positions. The valley's heart-shaped rice paddies, now churned into mud that reached the shins after mid-April storms, had become killing fields, where movement during daylight meant certain death. Men learned to crawl on elbows through muck that preserved the scent of cordite and worse things that siege warfare inevitably produced. Fingernails packed with clay and explosive residue became badges of service in a campaign where cleanliness was impossible and dignity a forgotten luxury. Cadres rotated assault companies through different tasks to distribute the psychological burden that was grinding down both armies. One night, a unit might drag logs for trench revetments, hauling timber through approaches barely wide enough for human shoulders. The next night, they would carry wounded comrades wrapped in ponchos that reeked of iodine and wet straw, their groans mixing with the whistle of incoming shells and the distant sound of someone singing revolutionary songs to maintain morale. Field medics dressed wounds with scarce sulfur powder and boiled cloth strips, working by candlelight in dugouts that smelled of antiseptic, smoke, and the inevitable stench of battlefield latrines. The iodine sting became another layer of suffering in conditions that already challenged human endurance, but the alternative was infection that could kill more efficiently than French bullets. Giap's artillery staff had turned crater analysis into a precise science. Each shell impact was studied to determine the most effective fusing and trajectory for specific target types. Concrete bunkers required different techniques than personnel trenches, which demanded different approaches than ammunition storage points. This methodical approach reflected Chinese training that emphasized professional competence over revolutionary enthusiasm alone. Anti-aircraft belts continued to thicken around the valley as more 37mm guns arrived from Chinese supply sources. French pilots now faced coordinated flak from positions that had been surveyed and registered with the same precision applied to ground targets. The psychological pressure on aircrews became unbearable, flying into valleys where every hilltop bristled with guns that tracked their approach with mechanical persistence. Wind drift from high-altitude drops continued to scatter French supply bundles into Viet Minh hands. Red, white, and green parachute silk disappeared into tunnel networks where captured ammunition fed the very guns that were strangling the garrison. Each misdirected bundle represented not just lost supplies for the French, but additional firepower for their enemies, a mathematical progression that made the siege's outcome increasingly inevitable. Viet Minh scouts had learned to track parachute landings by sound, following the distinctive thump of supply containers hitting muddy ground. Teams would emerge after dark to cut chutes and redistribute contents before dawn revealed their positions to French observers. The silk itself became valuable, repurposed as camouflage nets and medical bandages, while metal containers found new lives as ammunition, storage, and cooking pots. Political officers reminded troops that the Geneva Conference had opened on April 26th, adding diplomatic urgency to military necessity. Every position held, every attack successful, every French strongpoint that fell translated directly into leverage at negotiating tables where the future of Southeast Asia was being decided by men who had never heard artillery fire or smelled cordite mixed with monsoon rain. Picture yourself crouched in a firing position as May 5th gave way to May 6th, watching Katyusha rocket launchers being wheeled into position on heights that commanded the entire valley, weapons that would soon scream overhead like steel bamboo flutes, announcing the final phase of a siege that had already lasted longer than anyone expected. The climactic assault was about to begin, and when those rockets shrieked across Muong Than Valley, they would announce to the world that the age of European colonialism was ending in a thunderclap of high explosive and revolutionary determination. Katyusha rockets shrieked across Muong Than Valley at midday on May 6th like steel bamboo flutes screaming death songs, their sound mixing with the thunder of massed artillery in a crescendo that announced the final phase of a siege that had already lasted 54 days. This was the moment that would decide not just one battle, but the fate of European colonialism itself. In the next 30 hours, the accumulated weight of revolutionary determination would finally overwhelm the last defenses of an empire that had ruled Indochina for nearly a century. The sound of those rockets marked the beginning of the end of the old world order. Giap had unleashed everything he possessed. 5 divisions converged on French positions that had shrunk to a handful of muddy strongpoints barely a kilometre across. The artillery preparation began with conventional guns, 105mm howitzers, 120mm mortars, 75mm field pieces, all firing in coordinated salvos that walked methodically across targets that had been registered and re-registered over weeks of patient observation. Then came the Katyushas. The Soviet-designed rocket launchers had arrived via Chinese supply routes, their multiple launch tubes capable of saturating target areas with a density of fire that conventional artillery could never match. When the first salvo launched, the sound was unlike anything the valley had experienced, not the sharp crack of individual shells, but a continuous shriek that seemed to tear the air itself. A Viet Minh runner later described the sound as steel bamboo flutes screaming overhead, followed by a pressure wave that tasted of mud and metal filings. The rockets impacted in rapid succession, each explosion adding to a crescendo that shook the valley floor like an earthquake and sent debris fountaining skyward in eruptions that resembled volcanic activity more than conventional warfare. French defenders, already reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers from an original garrison of 16,000, huddled in bunkers that had become concrete tombs. Radio communications crackled with damage reports before sets were smashed by direct hits or abandoned by operators who fled positions that could no longer be defended. The systematic destruction was reaching its inevitable conclusion. At 17:30 hours on May 7th, with his command post overrun and his remaining positions isolated and cut off, Colonel Christian de Castries agreed to a ceasefire. The decision came not from cowardice but from mathematical reality. He simply had no troops left to continue fighting. Silence rolled over the basin except for sporadic shots and the hiss of rain on embers where ammunition dumps had been cooking off for hours. But the final assault that preceded this surrender had been a masterpiece of coordinated warfare that demonstrated how far the Viet Minh had evolved from the guerrilla force of French imagination. The great mine under Dien had detonated in early May, with a roar that was felt rather than heard, heaving a crater that swallowed concrete bunkers whole and stunned defenders senseless, with concussion waves that rolled across the valley like thunder from beneath the earth. The explosion created a pit so deep it steamed like a hot spring in the cool mountain air, its sides lined with the twisted remnants of French fortifications that had taken weeks to construct and seconds to obliterate. Assault troops poured into the gap while defenders stumbled through smoke and dust, their ears bleeding from pressure waves that had scrambled their ability to distinguish up from down. Shaped charges and Bangalore torpedoes had cleared lanes through defensive wire that sappers had been mapping for weeks. The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible for the remaining French forces to concentrate their fire effectively. Machine gun nests that had held out for days were suddenly flanked by assault teams that materialized from tunnel entrances that had been invisible until the moment they disgorged armed men into the heart of French positions. The final night barrage on March 30th and 31st had provided a preview of what coordinated firepower could accomplish. French guns firing point-blank had torn gaps in a Viet Minh regiment caught on open ground, proof to political cadres that strike surely meant patience, sapping, and mining rather than human wave attacks that squandered lives for temporary gains. But by May 6th, there were no more French guns capable of firing point-blank or any other way. Viet Minh counter-battery fire had systematically destroyed artillery positions whose locations had been plotted and registered over weeks of careful observation. The few surviving guns had no ammunition to fire, their supply lines cut by infantry that controlled everything except the shrinking perimeter around the command bunkers. Individual acts of courage continued until the end. French legionnaires and paratroopers fought from positions that had become individual graves, their ammunition exhausted, and their communications severed but their discipline intact. Some strongpoints held out for hours after the general ceasefire, isolated garrisons that continued firing until they were overrun or their ammunition ran out. Vietnamese auxiliaries faced impossible choices as their French officers died around them, and Viet Minh loudspeakers offered surrender terms in languages that reminded them of home villages far from this contested valley. Many chose to lay down their arms rather than die for a cause that had never been theirs. their defection hastening the collapse of a defense that depended on willing collaboration. The weather added its own commentary to the battle's conclusion. Monsoon rains hissed against hot metal and turned crater puddles into steaming pools that reflected parachute flares and muzzle flashes. The air itself seemed to weep as cordite smoke mixed with mountain mist to create a fog that carried the mingled sense of explosive, wet earth and human suffering. When dawn broke on May 8th, the silence was more shocking than the bombardment that had preceded it. Valley floors that had echoed with gunfire for 56 days suddenly offered only the sound of wind through broken trees and the drip of water from shattered bunkers. Smoke rose from scattered fires where ammunition continued to cook off, but the systematic thunder of artillery had ended forever. Viet Minh medical teams emerged from their tunnels to treat wounded from both sides, their first priority being soldiers, whose injuries required immediate attention regardless of which uniform they wore. The revolution that had begun with promises of national liberation was concluding with demonstrations of humanity that transcended the brutalities of siege warfare. Picture yourself standing in one of those smouldering French positions as the last shots echoed across a valley that had been transformed into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal, knowing that you had witnessed the exact moment when one historical epoch ended and another began. But victory carried a price that would become clear only when prisoners began their 600-kilometer march to camps in the north, and when casualty reports revealed the true cost of proving that peasant determination could crack the foundations of empire itself. Columns of prisoners snaked 600 kilometers on foot through mountain passes, where villagers stared at dusty parachute silk scarves tied as slings and tourniquets, the remnants of French empire reduced to a ragged procession, disappearing into the northern mists. This final march embodied the revolutionary transformation that had just reshaped the balance of world power. In 56 days, a peasant army had demonstrated that no empire, no matter how technologically advanced, could survive when an entire people refused to accept foreign domination. The prisoners trudging toward re-education camps carried more than personal defeat. They bore witness to the end of the colonial age itself. The mathematics of victory were staggering. Viet Minh forces had captured 11,721 prisoners, approximately 4,436 of them wounded. This represented the largest haul they had ever taken in 8 years of Revolutionary War, more prisoners than many entire campaigns had produced. The French garrison had been not just defeated but annihilated, its remnants scattered across a valley that resembled a moonscape more than the rice bowl it had once been. But victory statistics told only part of the story. Of the roughly 10,863 prisoners eventually processed through northern camps, only 3,290 would be repatriated when the Geneva Accords were finally implemented. The gap between those numbers represented deaths from wounds, disease, and the brutal conditions of forced marches through terrain that challenged even healthy men. The prisoner columns moved at night when possible, guided by Viet Minh escorts who had learned every mountain trail during months of supply operations. French officers wrapped in torn parachute silk walked alongside Foreign Legion sergeants whose boots had disintegrated during the siege, their feet bound in strips cut from abandoned equipment. The democratic equality of defeat reduced colonels and privates to the same basic struggle for survival. Vietnamese villagers along the route watched these processions with expressions that mixed curiosity with something deeper, the recognition that they were witnessing history's pivot point. Children who had never seen Europeans except as distant figures of authority now observed them as broken men dependent on revolutionary mercy for their next meal and their next breath. The broader casualty figures remained disputed decades later, reflecting both the chaos of siege warfare and the political sensitivities surrounding losses that had shaken two nations. Scholarly estimates of Viet Minh casualties ranged from 13,000 to 22,900 total losses, numbers that testified to the ferocity of battles fought in conditions that challenged human endurance. These statistics represented more than tactical exchanges. Every casualty was a family destroyed, a village that would forever remember the son who never returned from Dien Bien Phu. The revolution had succeeded, but its price was measured in grief that would echo through generations of families whose sacrifice had made independence possible. Phan Dinh Giot had become a symbol of that sacrifice, his name entering textbooks as the epitome of revolutionary devotion. The young soldier who had plugged a French firing port with his body at Strongpoint Beatrice would be remembered not just as an individual hero, but as representative of thousands who had made similar choices throughout the campaign. His story embodied the fusion of personal courage with national purpose that had made victory possible. But heroic narratives could not obscure the human reality of what siege warfare had demanded from both armies. French medical officers who survived described conditions that would have challenged peacetime hospitals performing surgery by candlelight with instruments sterilized in rice wine, amputating limbs with mess hall knives when proper surgical tools were unavailable, watching men die from infections that antibiotics could have cured if supply lines had remained open. Viet Minh medical teams faced similar challenges, with even fewer resources. Field hospitals carved into mountain caves treated wounds with traditional herbal medicines when modern supplies ran out, their medics learning to extract shrapnel with tools improvised from captured equipment. The dedication of medical personnel from both sides represented warfare's paradox, the simultaneous capacity for destruction and healing that defined human nature under extreme stress. The siege's conclusion resonated far beyond the valley itself. Radio broadcasts carried news of French defeat to listeners across the colonial world, from Algeria to Indonesia, where independence movements suddenly saw proof that European power could be broken by determined resistance. The psychological impact was immeasurable. If Vietnamese peasants could destroy a modern army, then liberation was possible anywhere colonialism still existed. At the Geneva Conference, news of Dien Bien Phu's fall transformed diplomatic calculations overnight. France accepted partition at the July 20th Geneva Accords, recognizing that military reality had made political compromise inevitable. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam's negotiating position had been written in artillery shells and sealed with the sacrifice of soldiers who would never see the independence their deaths had purchased. The environmental aftermath told its own story. Bomb craters filled with monsoon water to become permanent pools where no rice would grow for years. Shattered trees marked artillery impact points that would remain visible to satellite photography decades later. The landscape itself bore scars that testified to warfare's capacity to transform geography along with political boundaries. But the most profound transformation was cultural. Songs composed during the campaign like Ho Keo Phao and Giai Phong Dien Bien entered the national repertoire as anthems of liberation that would echo at anniversary parades for generations. The rubber tire sandals worn by Viet Minh soldiers became symbols of revolutionary resourcefulness, displayed in museums as artifacts of a war fought with determination rather than industrial might. Names entered legend alongside geography. Pha Dinh Pass became synonymous with sacrifice, its switchbacks remembered as the route where artillery pieces were hauled by human strength alone. Vo Nguyen Giap achieved immortality as the general who proved that professional military education could emerge from revolutionary commitment when guided by clear political purpose. The tactical innovations developed during the siege would influence warfare for decades. Anti-aircraft umbrellas, cave-sighted artillery, and tunnel systems that extended for kilometers demonstrated how conventional technology could be offset by unconventional methods when applied with sufficient patience and coordination. These lessons would reverberate through later conflicts in ways that neither side fully anticipated. Sensory memories lingered longest for survivors from both armies. The smell of cordite mixed with monsoon rain, the taste of mud and metal filings after rocket barrages, the sound of hemp ropes creaking under impossible loads. These details would surface in dreams and conversations for the rest of their lives, binding former enemies together through shared experience of warfare at its most fundamental level. Think of yourself standing in that transformed valley as silence finally settled over positions that had thundered with gunfire for 56 days, knowing that you had witnessed the exact moment when the old world order cracked and something entirely new began to emerge from its ruins. The last image belonged to the Viet Minh trenches. Soaked uniforms, rubber sandals, a bamboo ladder leaning into the dark, then the signal flare, and 100 boots thudding forward in mud toward the final French bunker. But this time, the charge succeeded, and when dawn broke over Muang Than Valley on May 8, 1954, it illuminated a landscape where the sun of empire had finally set, and the dawn of independence had begun to rise over a people who had proven that no power on earth could enslave a nation determined to be free.